Steve, do you mind clicking mute? Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to let a few more participants join, and then we will start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on new strategies to mitigate climate change risk and build greater resilience. My name is Jasmine De Silva, and it is my pleasure to be your host. I am the Business Development Manager for Risk and Insurance Solutions at the Bermuda Business Development Agency, also known as the BDA. The BDA is an independent public-private partnership for economic development. For decades, Bermuda's reinsurance market has played a lead role in protecting the world against the impact of natural catastrophes. With the effects of climate change increasing, Bermuda's role as the world's climate risk capital is more relevant now than ever. So today, we are delighted to be acting as a facilitator to host this critically important discussion with some of the experts in this space. Just before we start, if you do have any questions for our presenters today, please submit them by typing them in the question box, not the chat box. And we will reserve time at the end of the presentation for question and answers. Our moderator this afternoon is Stephen Weinstein. He is the General Counsel at Renaissance Re and a Deputy Chair of the BDA. As Chief Legal Officer, Steve has responsibility for legal, regulatory, government affairs, and compliance matters on a global basis. He also serves as chair of the Renaissance Re Risk Sciences Foundation, which is committed to researching and developing risk mitigation techniques. I will now hand it over to Steve, who will introduce all of our esteemed panelists. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. And hello, everyone. Let me also add my thanks to each of you for joining us today. I hope this finds each of you healthy and as well as can be in these challenging times. You know, when scheduling conferences, or in today's environment, webinars like this, one sometimes asks, what's the hook? Why is this relevant? Is this topic timely? I don't think anyone can debate that the discussion that we're about to have isn't timely or important, and we certainly had no shortage of hooks. Maybe our hook was the launch of the annual Atlantic storm season, with ocean temperatures already at historic highs. Maybe it's the fact that we've seen the formation of the first G-named storm earlier this year than at any time in history. Maybe our hook is because you've experienced the rising risk from wildfires, which seem to have a season and just confront us across the calendar. Maybe our hook for you is the release this week of an important report from the World Climate Research Program, which has concluded in compelling fashion that the lower range of adverse consequences, the best worst case scenario from climate change and rising global temperatures, is already off the table. Maybe the hook for you today was the letter this week from dozens of sophisticated institutional investors managing hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, urging US federal and state and global regulators to act urgently to treat climate change as a systemic risk worthy of immediate mitigation and disclosure. Those hooks are all risks, but maybe your hook was one of the recent opportunities that we've seen and many signs of progress that we're engaged with. Just this week, we saw Congress pass perhaps the most consequential conservation bill in decades. We've just seen the release of an extraordinary report from Congress outlining actionable yet transformative changes that, in my view, are well within our reach. And maybe you've seen one of the many signs of action from the business and investor community. For example, in the US, just this week, we saw one of the largest financial services firms commit to quantifying and measuring the climate impacts of its products. And as Jasmine noted, in Bermuda, where we are both based, the private sector and Bermuda's government are committed to building on Bermuda's global leadership in mitigating climate-driven natural disasters to ensconcing Bermuda as the climate risk financial capital of the world. We've got a lot to cover today, and our two speakers, to whom I'm immensely grateful, are both astute and clear-headed about the risks that we face, but among the most action-oriented, optimistic, and inspiring people in the space, and I'm so grateful they can spend this time with us and with you. I'll go in reverse order and introduce first Colin Omar, a friend and the CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, America's largest wildlife conservation organization with 52 state and territorial affiliates and nearly 6 million members, ranging from climate passionate scientists to hunters, anglers, birders, gardeners, and more. Colin serves on more boards and has more positions than we have time to name. I urge you to review his resume. But I do want to point out that his immediate prior position was in leadership in the state of Delaware, where in 2009, Colin was the youngest state cabinet official in the nation. In addition to leading his organization and leading our national effort on climate risk mitigation and conservation, climate, and this I can attest, spends every possible moment in nature, fishing, hunting, hiking, and birding with his wife and family. Speaking first will be our mutual friend, Sam Medlock. Sam currently is serving as senior counsel for the U.S. Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which is focusing on climate adaptation and resilience, our topics for today. But Sam has gone from achievement to achievement and strength to strength in the private sector, in the NGO space, and in academia and in prior government posts. Most recently, she had a senior position in our industry, the reinsurance sector. And prior to that, was a senior member of the Obama White House, serving on the environmental quality and the CEQ and also the OMB. So Sam too has more achievements than we have time to list. I want to get right to the conversation and begin things by turning things over to Sam. Sam, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I really want to thank our gracious host, the Business Development Agency of Bermuda, and Steve for that gracious welcome and introduction. I'm going to jump right in and make great use of our time together today, provide a quick overview of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and our recently released report, the Climate Crisis Action Plan. The Select Committee on the Climate Crisis was created specifically to make recommendations to Congress on ways to confront the climate crisis. We held more than 17 hearings, 6 roundtables, thousands of discussions, hundreds of responses to our request for information. We received input from a wide range of stakeholders, including elected officials, tribal leaders, scientists, business leaders, public health advocates, youth activists, and individuals representing communities on the front lines of climate change. Our report and recommendations are organized across 12 pillars that address infrastructure, clean energy, reducing emissions, building jobs, addressing the disproportionate impacts of pollution and disasters on low-income households, people of color, and frontline communities, and ways to support states, local governments, tribes, and territories in adapting to the impacts of the climate crisis that can no longer be avoided. We believe that the science foundation of federal policy and action is where things should always begin. So we do call for a strengthening and a sustaining of federal funding for the foundational research and assessments of the Earth's climate system and climate change impacts. We call to establish a climate risk information service that can deploy actionable climate risk information and expand Earth monitoring and data collection for public safety, climate risk modeling, and in the incorporation of future risks into the projections of climate change. We also call to invest in STEM education and climate literacy, and to strengthen federal scientific integrity policies. We also want to see science embedded in the design of building codes and standards, and into the metrics for how we design federal programs and how we cite and design federally funded projects. This is all towards supporting climate resilient communities and infrastructure. So we do want to transform the nation's infrastructure to better withstand extreme weather and climate impacts by ensuring that federally supported infrastructure meets climate-informed standards for siting, design, maintenance, and rebuilding. Based on the early lessons of the current pandemic, we also need to better prepare for the physical and mental health effects of the climate crisis by improving the resilience of public health supply chains and our hospitals. We also want to support community leadership in climate resilience and equity. We call for a new climate adaptation program that provides skilled technical assistance to states, local governments, tribes, and territories to support their adaptation planning, and to invest in climate resilient housing, infrastructure, and ecosystem restoration. Planning and projects should also support community-led, voluntary, and just transitions from the riskiest areas to safer ground. We specifically call for a partnership with tribes and indigenous communities for climate adaptation and resilience by removing barriers and building local capacity, and increasing funding to accelerate adaptation for vulnerable tribal and indigenous communities. We want to reduce disaster risks and accelerate disaster recovery by increasing the investment in pre-disaster mitigation and advancing resilience-based building codes and land use and development standards. We also want to increase the role of insurance in helping to address the increasing costs of disasters. We call for a strengthening of the National Flood Insurance Program so that that program is able to map future risks and reduce uninsured loss. And we also call for agencies across the federal government and government-sponsored enterprises that make loans to consider securing all federal loans and loan guarantees with flood insurance. But beyond the NFIP, we see opportunities to increase the role of insurance in climate risk management by exploring innovative insurance approaches, things like catastrophe bonds, parametric insurance, and public climate risk pools to identify opportunities for cost savings, but also opportunities for efficiencies and ways to get actionable information in front of state and local governments to inform their decisions. We also want to help prepare for longer and hotter wildfire seasons by improving mapping of fire-prone areas, reducing wildland fuels that can threaten communities, and increasing federal support for community planning, technical assistance, and wildfire risk mitigation. We make a full body of recommendations around protecting and restoring natural resources. We want to see naturally functioning coastal and riparian ecosystems that can filter and store floodwaters, but also address pollution. And then finally, we call for a strengthening of the national security and defense enterprises by enhancing interagency coordination, identifying and responding to climate impacts on national security, armed forces missions, global conflicts, and geopolitical instability, and ensuring that federal procurement and planning and decisions for our military installations incorporate climate risk. Finally, we think it's important that the US leadership on the international stage be restored. So we call for advancing of clean energy and climate resilience in international missions, and increasing foreign aid through US development finance programs. So I'll wrap up there and really look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thanks.
Sam, thanks so much. That's a remarkably comprehensive and concise summary of an extraordinary body of work. And if you haven't read the report of the Select Committee, I'd urge you to do so. It weighs in at a scant 550 pages, but every page is ripe with information and compelling thought leadership. And at some point, perhaps in the course of this conversation, we'll post a link to it, or it's easily findable. Colin, it's been a busy and momentous few weeks in public policy and for NWF. The mic is yours as you walk us through some of the highlights.
No, thank you. And it's wonderful to be with all of you. And Steve, thank you for being a good friend and for inviting me to this, and to Jasmine for BDA hosting. And we're at an inflection point, right? I mean, there aren't a whole lot of solutions that are out there right now on the landscape that can simultaneously address the COVID-19 pandemic, I would argue, the massive inequities that we have in American society in particular, and as well as around the world, the massive climate risks that we continue to have, and then the economic need to kind of restart the global economy. And so right now, what we're seeing is that making the case for smart investments in infrastructure, particularly natural defenses, and I'll talk more about that in a second, is one of the best ways to actually advance all four of those goals simultaneously. And I think everyone in this call, for the most part, is fairly aware of the massive cost savings, that ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure. If we can make smart mitigation investments up front. And we at the National Wildlife Federation have been pushing for a long time on the use of nature, the use of natural systems, use of wetlands and dune systems, of prairies and of healthy forests as a way to reduce risks for communities. I mean, when a hurricane comes through my home state of Delaware, the places where we have healthy wetlands, those wetlands can absorb 300,000 to 1 million gallons of water per individual acre. And so you can slow down the velocity, you can slow down the volume. And if that same area, that same acre was just paved, all of a sudden now you create a massive amount of water on the landscape that's frankly has nowhere to go, and you end up seeing massive damage on the property side. And so we've been working really hard with folks like Sam and others, trying to make this case that as we're thinking about how we rebuild the country, how we rebuild the world, that we're doing it in ways that are also reducing our risk long term and saving emissions. Because the other beauty of natural defenses is that you're also using nature to also sequester emissions. And we might be able to sequester as much as 20 to 30% of global emissions through better land management practices from both natural systems as well as working lands. And so I come to this conversation trying to make the case to each of you that there are no set of solutions that frankly meet this moment in time better than investments in resilience, and especially ones that reduce emissions simultaneously. Investments in natural defenses can create up to 33 jobs for $1 million US of money that you spend. And so you can put a ton of people to work. The reason for that, it's less materials intensive, it's a little less equipment intensive. So most of the money goes to labor. So as countries are thinking about ways to jumpstart their economy with some Keynesian stimulus, it's frankly one of the best ways that we can do that in a very cost-effective way. And it's frankly one of the most equitable ways to do it as well. I mean, a lot of places that are most vulnerable, particularly in the US context, are lower-lying communities that have often faced many of the greatest environmental injustices. I mean, these are communities that have historically been underinvested in. A lot of the infrastructure is outdated. In many cases, you have industrial facilities, particularly those that needed water, like coal plants and refineries, located in some of these communities. You see these dotted along, along Delaware Bay, where I am talking to you right now, but as well as the coast of Louisiana and to the coast of coastal Texas. And so you're at a point where you can actually drive investments that will create jobs, good paying jobs, that will drive investments into communities that are often left behind, reduce pollution, make communities safer, and in the long term save government or other entities billions of dollars, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in avoided costs by making sure that those systems were in place before the storm, before the catastrophic event occurred, and enjoying that savings of it being 4 to 10 times cheaper to make that upfront investment than it is to just pay for the consequences afterwards. And so I'm excited because in the US context in particular, a lot of these concepts were seen as kind of vanguard even 5 years ago are now very mainstream. I mean, we have Republicans and Democrats in the US context coming together around reform of the National Flood Insurance Program. We've been working hard on this program for a long time. We want to see actuarially sound rates. We want to make sure that there's a robust private market. Not all the risk has to be on the government side. There's huge opportunities for reinsurance, having markets that actually make sense, that are pricing the risk into various products, so we're not inadvertently putting people in harm's way. We've incentivized since the 1960s folks to live in pretty risky areas, whether that's along the coast or in inland floodplains. And so how do we begin thinking about kind of through market mechanisms as well as investment, both removing those incentives, but also making the investments to make people safer and creating a ton of jobs at the same time. And so it's a little like Lucy with the football, and I'm constantly optimistic we're gonna get to a deal, but there's a bipartisan energy behind making some of these systems work in a way maybe there isn't on some of the other kind of climate mitigation or climate emission reduction priorities that we have to also attain to on our pursuit of net zero emissions in the coming decades. So I'm pretty excited about the possibilities of driving tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into kind of really smart restoration and resilience projects that are going to have these multiple benefits. And there was a debate just a few weeks ago on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. They had a massive infrastructure package, and it was about a $1.5 billion package. And within that package, not tucked away as like just a standalone natural resources section, but built into every single part of it: the transportation sector, the energy sector, the built environment, and of course natural resources. There were smart natural solutions being built in. This idea that we can make communities healthier and safer at the same time by making these really smart strategic investments. And frankly, a lot of the thought leadership goes to Samantha, and the credit goes to Samantha and Kathy Castor, a congresswoman from Florida, who led the select committee that really put a lot of these ideas together in a way that really made sense for folks. We were kind of the 12 pillars that Sam talked about. All of a sudden now this whole kind of disparate universe of ideas that are always out there, all of a sudden now have a common framework and kind of showing now a way to show how they work together. So I'm really encouraged by this type of work. Like, I mean, I lived through it in Delaware during Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene the year before that. The places that have healthy natural resources fare incredibly better than places that don't. And it makes perfect sense. But in Delaware, you had an incredible case study in that on one side of the bay, Delaware, we had protected a lot of our wetlands. We had spent a lot of money on restoration projects. On the New Jersey side of the line, not to make fun of our friends in the Garden State, but there's a lot more development. There's a lot more pavement. There's a lot less natural infrastructure, a lot more gray infrastructure. And the seawalls failed. I mean, a lot of the adjacent parcels. And so it's not theory anymore. And frankly, these are investments that have a great return. They're investments that do create huge amounts of savings and reduce liability. So whether you're the property owner or the insurance entity, there are huge upsides to having those ounces of prevention being invested. But we're at a point now where we're going to be facing pretty scary hurricane season from all indications, as Steve was talking about, surface water temperatures and some of the other indicators that we have. I'm really concerned in the U.S. context about fire season. The drought conditions are high, water levels are low, soil moisture levels are low. And so in the midst of a pandemic, and obviously the U.S. has done a poorer job responding to the pandemic than nearly anyone else in the world, at a time when we need folks to basically be sheltering in place, there's going to be big parts of the country where that's just physically not possible. Because you're going to see hurricanes come through, we're going to have more inland flooding, we're going to have record fires most likely in a few states. And so this conversation is incredibly timely. And it's become cliche, the idea of not allowing a crisis to go to waste. But if we're going to have to invest massive amounts of money to get our economy going, what better way to do that than by making the very investments that are going to put folks to work, making our communities more resilient, reducing risks long-term, keeping people safe, and having healthier natural resources for the critters that me and Ranger Rick and the team of the National Wildlife Federation really care about. It is the ultimate win-win-win. And I'm just really grateful for all the leadership of the Bermuda business community, of the Bermuda government, really being on the vanguard of these solutions. Because frankly, we could learn a lot from the kind of progressive way you've been thinking about these solutions, and frankly, use a little more of that thinking on the mainland as we're trying to grapple with these massive challenges of our time. Back to you, Steve.
My goodness, Colin and Sam, thank you both so much. There's so much to chew on in those two rapid presentations that I'm almost at wit's end to where to start. But why don't we start, Colin, more or less just where you ended? And as I listen to, I'm always struck, I'm so frequently struck when the three of us are together by the fact that each of you make a business case for mitigation and resilience. The flip side of risk is economic opportunity. And the way you communicate some of the benefits of the policy proposals you advocated, it saves money. On that statistic you mentioned just now, that for every dollar we invest in natural capital solutions, we create 33 jobs. We've all talked in the past that investments in mitigation can save $4 to $8 of disaster recovery costs. Let's double click on that for a minute. What are some of the other initiatives where we've had successes? We've talked about flood insurance, in many respects, the Select Climate Committee report is a roadmap of other programs that impose taxpayer risk, but also present new business and economic opportunities. And with that, maybe I'll ask you, Sam, if there's anything you'd like to highlight from your work about other policies you touched upon flood, and then turn it back from Colin for some other areas where National Wildlife is promoting market-based adaptation strategies.
The opportunities are almost too numerous to list. I really think that we are at a time where the science of risk and understanding future risk has caught up with an impatience for the deployment of tools and information and ways to use very limited public dollars more efficiently. We've also seen through examples with the National Flood Insurance Program, but also examples from the application of business tools around the world, a real proof of concept. And so this is where I think that across the federal government, but also for state and local governments, it's an important time to be considering ways to be partnering with the private sector, new ways to be tapping sources of private capital. And so I don't want to get out ahead of some of those conversations that we know that federal agencies are having with industry, but it is without question very promising in three important ways. One, beyond simply the ability to transfer risk off of a public portfolio is the information that comes through analyzing that portfolio and understanding the risk that is currently being held by the federal treasury and taxpayers. So it's the robust analytics that industry can be providing that I think has been very interesting and promising. And then there's the risk transfer itself, but it's also the ways that private capital can be moving efficiently and quickly. It is that immediate liquidity in the wake of a disaster that can be so important to stem humanitarian impacts. When we see federal programs post-disaster that may not move as quickly and may even take months or years to reach survivors. So those are three important ways that I think are prompting a much closer look at exploration of public-private partnership.
Yeah, Steve, I would just add that, I mean, it's the repetitive losses, both in terms of individual properties, but also in terms of frequency of the storms, right? When you're talking year after year of hundreds of billions of dollars of loss, like the current model of basically we'll pay to pick up the pieces as opposed to investing, a fraction of that to actually bolster the resilience, is making is leading to a much more rational bipartisan conversation than even a few years ago. I mean, we talk about the U.S. having a $24 trillion debt, and that's actually not even true, right? Because that number does not incorporate any climate risk at all. None of that's built in. That's just obligations of past spending. It does not include any kind of future liabilities. And so it's a little like if you don't paint your house, if you don't make sure that your foundation is strong, if you don't take care of little maintenance things. Like, yeah, you might save some money in the short term, but the catastrophic impacts of that long term are massive. And unfortunately, governments just aren't set up that way. I agree with Sam that the private sector can be more forward thinking, but look, we have massive market failures right now in the US and Europe and other places because these risks aren't fully priced in yet. We're starting to see them priced in the coastal environment. I think a little bit in like the inland floodplain area. The fire pieces still are kind of a mess, and the insurance products there are a little more nascent in some ways. But I mean, I think it's a massive realization that if we don't adapt quickly, if we don't make these upfront investments, the long-term consequences and the financial implications of that for taxpayers, for businesses, for the overall macro economy are absolutely devastating. And I think that's at that moment, it's the old Churchill quote: "The U.S. will do the right thing after exhausting every other option." We're getting close to having exhausted pretty much everything else as we're on this path to hopefully better policy.
Let's stay there for just 1 second, because I think that's entirely right, that the enormous deficits that we see reported in the way that they're calculated are known expenditures. Our sector, and Sam spent some time in our sector, deals with uncertainty. and the actuarial cost of the holes that we're digging are not calculated. But if you provide subsidized flood insurance and don't charge enough for it, Colin mentioned the actuarial unsoundness of the program, and for certain state programs which provide climate-driven risk protection, you're building an actuarial hole that you're asking your neighbors to pay for. We also don't appropriately value natural capital. So I wonder if I can invite you to comment a bit more about that. When we pave over marshes, we make a buck, but we destroy the value of the storm buffering that those environments provide, as well as the other economic benefits that those endemic habitats can provide to Americans in communities of all kinds. How can we better price in the signal of green infrastructure and other natural capital and incentivize behavior that provides more economic prosperity for the country as a whole?
Yeah, I feel like you're going to make me recite that Bobby Kennedy speech about 1968 about the way we calculate GDP. But look, I mean, we take these resources for granted, right? We take the natural water quality filtration value of a wetland or of a grassland. We don't include that. But we'll look at the much more expensive, often mechanical engineered solution, to clean up water that's already polluted, further downstream. Same thing with these natural systems. And so I do think that there's market signals. I think there's ways, and the flood insurance program has piloted some of this, where you get a lower rate if you've taken certain mitigation measures, and increasingly that mitigation kind of bundle of things that a community can do can include some natural solutions. I think there's more progress to be made there. Same thing in a fire context. I mean, if folks are willing to take steps to reduce their risk, there's ways to have that market signal then priced into the various products that they're getting for insurance. But it is a bigger problem, right? I mean, in the budget, right? If you cut down a tree on a national forest, that shows up as revenue. If you preserve a tree to sequester more carbon, at least in the current environment, that doesn't show up on the ledger anywhere. And so I think it's something we're always pushing on. I'm really trying to have both market signals if we're going to have tax credits for various types of investments that reduce risk on the engineered side, like why not have the same credits apply with the same level of rigor on the natural side? If we're going to give people credit for tax credits for clean energy, if they're willing to have better agriculture practices or forestry practices that sequester carbon, let's give that the same level of credit. And there's a lot of those ideas that are baked into the select committee's report. But I do think this is a bigger conversation. And one of the things that I've been kind of pushing on congressional leadership on is that right now, if I wanted to spend $100 billion to make the coasts around the country more resilient, that would just show up as an expenditure. The avoided cost from that does not show up on any kind of accounting. I mean, there's been all these kind of crazy accounting systems that different parties have put in place at different times. But I would argue that something that's definitely going to save money over time should show up as having that ROI calculated in the way that things are scored in the congressional system. So if I'm going to save you $4 by spending $1, I shouldn't have to come up with an offset to spend that first dollar because you're going to get a savings on the back end. And I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but there is just this lack of appreciation where we'll spend, we're so excited when we're able to convince, Congress to spend 5 or 6% of a recovery package on pre-storm mitigation to prevent the next storm. But it's always cents on the dollar, right? It's always a few pennies. And I think until we flip that model where we're really kind of first and foremost focused on reducing risk, we'll continue to kind of bear the brunt of the price and the personal catastrophic kind of damage for families and businesses on the back end. We really just have to flip the model. And that's why I'm so excited about the conversations that are going on right now, because I think they finally could turn the corner on something that has been a little stuck for a few years.
That's right. Colin is so right. And this is why we recommend that ways of integrating the valuation of natural services be embedded in federal programs. We know anecdotally all the things that are being discussed here, the ways that intact, healthy, functioning ecosystems provide free services day in and day out in attenuating storm surge or helping to mitigate wildfire risk or improve air quality. But in federal programs and policies, we do need science that can crisply define and inform those costs, define and inform how we calculate benefits, and then ultimately make sure that proposed legislation is accurately assessed for how it could be impacting the climate crisis or disaster risk, as well as proposed programs or projects. Having worked in the Office of Management and Budget, I recognize the need to modernize the way that we calculate benefit and cost in the design of federal programs and federally funded projects, whether it's bridges or dams or levees or wastewater treatment plants. So by bringing that science and understanding, we are able to make sure that we're accurately calculating benefit cost and designing federal programs that are going to go as far as possible, but can incorporate benefits that can accrue over time into the future. This has been the challenge, and in many ways, federal analyses have been stuck. But by bringing in life cycle cost analysis and fully calculating benefits and costs, we can really advance the way that we're spending every single federal dollar.
Thanks so much for that, Sam. Let's shift gears slightly and address one of the elephants in the room, in the virtual room, the pandemic. It's really highlight the challenges of systemic global risks, climate risk being the other big systemic global risks. I wonder if I can invite you to comment on what are we learning about successes and failures in grappling with the pandemic crisis, and how can we apply those lessons learned to better mitigating the climate crisis?
I'm happy to start. Without question, the pandemic, like so many shocks to a system, has a way of revealing and exploiting vulnerabilities that have long existed, particularly for low-income folks, for people of color, and for folks that struggle day in and day out. And it reveals vulnerabilities in our economic system. This is why the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis took some additional time to look at what the early lessons of the pandemic are and to integrate those lessons into our thinking, and to also look at ways to advance a recovery from this current emergency that better prepare us for the next one. One big area is in the calculation of impacts and data, the way that we calculate who has been affected, and the demographics of folks that have been affected. When that is opaque, it makes it harder to inform policy and action. So this is one of the reasons that among our recommendations around public health resilience, we do call for ways to improve the compilation of data, the deployment of that data, and the public's accessibility of data and information about public health emergencies. We also recognize that state and local governments, tribes and territories really need federal investment in strengthening supply chains and in strengthening our nation's public health infrastructure. So that's one of the reasons that we make recommendations to strengthen the brick and mortar of our hospitals, clinics, and nursing homes, including our VA facilities for our veterans, as well as the surge planning and the operational planning for those facilities. It is absolutely fundamental both to the ways that we're going to respond and recover from this emergency, but also to prepare for the kinds of future pandemics and increased frequency of tropical or zoonotic disease that we know the impacts of climate change can bring.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Sam said. I think I'll just add three things. The first one is that, I mean, leadership matters. And I think if the catastrophic failure of U.S. leadership in this case is terrifying from a climate point of view. I mean, the questioning of the science, the not listening to experts, and so how we not just have good data, but make sure that it's believed. And there's just been an erosion of intentional attacks on those institutions for years, and unfortunately people are literally dying because of that now. So I do think that's one area that we have to keep in mind. Messenger matters, and having consistent science-based leadership is going to be absolutely essential. The second piece is that this isn't linear. I think a lot of folks kind of assume climate impacts are going to be somewhat gradual, and we're going to see or just the frequency, the intensity is going to increase. I mean, you're going to see, storms and fires and floods that are just more and more intense in different places. But it's not going to be entirely predictable. It's not going to be necessary year to year. I mean, most people on this call know that, but that's still a debate, a point of contention in the debate in the U.S. And again, I mean, to Samantha's point, the impacts on Black and Brown communities, the impacts on kind of frontline communities are massive, and the infrastructure isn't there. And whether that's in some parts of Louisiana or in lower income communities along the East Coast, or it's in the tribal nations or territories, the amount of work to ensure that everyone has kind of an equitable level of resilience investment is going to require deep investments in some of those communities. And then the third thing is the role of nature. I mean, I think one thing that's been incredibly frustrating for me throughout this pandemic is that there still isn't nearly enough discussion about the origins. And despite some attempts at trying to make the case that it was weaponized in a lab, almost the biologists that I have and that we work with around the globe are convinced that it truly is zoonotic. So as we're encroaching further into habitat, as we're having more kind of the illicit trade of live animals, that you're going to see more of this. And so actually doing more to conserve nature and making sure that these systems are more intact, limiting contact with wild animals, particularly a huge range of the kind of huge networks of trade that exist, including activities in the U.S. and places like Bermuda, as well as really investing in the science. Right, we don't invest in wildlife health the same way we do in other things. We invest a fraction of the amount on zoonotic diseases as we do some other diseases, even though zoonotic diseases are about 75% of all the emerging diseases on the landscape. And so I think having kind of data-driven, kind of investments and kind of prioritization leading to better outcomes is one of the big lessons, because we neither did what we needed to do on the front end, nor have been able to respond in the midterm, which is then setting up these, catastrophic inequities and likely a global depression on the back end for those failures.
A quick perspective from our sector, and then perhaps a transition, are that some of the same dynamics that impact our view of aspects of climate-driven financial risk, whether they're flood or crop, or aspects of mortgage risk of warmer air, warmer water, habitat loss, and demographic changes, putting more people where the risk is highest, with the types of moral hazard signaling that we've already discussed, were contributing factors to this pandemic and more likely to be encountered more frequently in the future. And then Colin, you mentioned leadership. So behind several of us is a visual of Bermuda. Bermuda actually does look like that, as you know. And I feel compelled to point out Bermuda's leadership and community did a pretty good job so far in the pandemic, with transparent information, modeling the behaviors, when mistakes were made, acknowledging them and correcting them with swift action, and sharing data. And Jasmine and I locked ourselves down for 3 weeks, and the whole community did. And as a result, Bermuda is in a better place. It's safe, close, and secure, and has invested in testing capacity and a range of other communications. So we have learned distinctions between areas which took different paths, and that can also help our adaptation going forward. But speaking of Bermuda, I've had the privilege of seeing you both in Bermuda and taking you around a bit. You've visited our own natural habitats, areas where Bermuda is endemic and unique birds have been nesting and growing back, seeing our unique in the world coral reef, our world-class scientific institution that's studying the impact of climate change in the world's oceans, the Bermuda Institute for Ocean Science, and you've each touched about the Bermuda reinsurance industry. What can Bermuda do better? If you can offer, as we aspire to that leadership that Jasmine and I both touched on, to be the broader climate risk capital of the world, how can Team Bermuda do more to help the U.S. recover and to address the risks of the future? We'd love your advice.
I think it's a great question. And the natural resources are amazing. And I still remember on that trip, Steve, I got to see your endemic skink, this very small kind of snake with legs. That's a great species you can only see on the island. I do think walking the walk on the project side could be one place to think about. I think connecting not just the financial markets and the incredible leadership and your political leadership and your economic leadership has been great as a country. But thinking about some of those, really spotlighting that the island's also making the investments on the resilience side, and then highlighting the ones that are. And I know there's a few of them. You showed me a few when I was there, but really spotlighting those and turning them into kind of signature projects that everybody, when they visit the island, goes to see because they want to have the best in class type projects. Because I do think that you are looked to so much for kind of financial leadership, that there's just an opportunity to connect, a lot of suits that are doing great work, kind of thinking about markets, but maybe it's a little, I don't know, not counterintuitive, but maybe a little outside some folks' lane to be then thinking about natural solutions that could actually help reduce risk and reduce both potential payouts and actually make the economics of various types of ventures more profitable even. And so that might be one area to think about. How do you become like a living laboratory in even a more pronounced way, in a more obvious way, where you're not just kind of having smarter tools, but you're also doing the hard work, especially given where you sit, in the landscape. Those are investments that will pay handsome dividends in the long term, but they also could just solidify your global leadership position as well.
Yeah, completely agree. And I also have so many fond memories of visits to Bermuda and getting to spend time with you all there. A couple of things that really stand out for me as both an incredible memory and moment of reflection, but also I think an opportunity for doubling down on the commitments that you all are already showing out of Team Bermuda, if you will, is the visits that I've had with BIOS and the extraordinary science capability that is available because of your unique geography, and the ways that BIOS and other Bermuda-based institutions can be contributing to the regional science enterprise for this part of the Atlantic, but also globally. And being able to really understand the ways that our oceans and atmospheres are behaving. The second way I think is continuing to help translate that basic science into the design of the built environment. Another thing that is really striking for me when I visit Bermuda is the ways that you all do not have the option of evacuating when hurricanes come. You may move some of your folks that are at the lowest lying areas, but by and large, Bermuda is very good at building strong and hunkering down and having a really strong public preparedness enterprise. I think US communities would have a lot to learn about how you build, the ways that you assure steady water supplies, the ways that you make sure that when folks do shelter in place, they can do so perhaps for extended periods of time, and the way that you all have made preparedness and resilience part of the Bermuda culture. And then lastly, I would say, think about the ways that you all could be doubling down on the deployment, not just of capital and risk transfer capacity, but also technical assistance. Just speaking on my own behalf, this is not a recommendation of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, but there's a good case to be made. For every dollar we put into the built environment, we should be investing equally in the technical assistance and capacity building for our states, local governments, tribes, and territories. And in my view, those that understand risk are very well placed to help others do so. For so many local leaders, they know they want to and need to build differently and change the landscape of the design of vulnerable communities, but they need some help understanding exactly where to start. So where we do call for strong investments in technical assistance, helping to design those solutions is going to be really important. And I think that Team Bermuda has a great role to play in that. It's not about production of a plan or a binder that's going to sit on a shelf. It's about changing strategy and really getting down to the design of communities. And that's a very human experience that you all can be helping to inform.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
We have one other thought as well. I do think that there's an incredible humility that you have, that Jasmine has, that other leaders I've met from Bermuda. This is one of those times where we need folks to be a little more brazen, right? Be willing to share the success story that is Bermuda, right? I mean, I've learned so much working with you and your team that now is informing the U.S. conversation. I mean, the work that you've done in Florida, for example, that's completely, kind of changed the state level thinking there. I think you're in a position collectively, and we want to do this with you, of course, But to really kind of, you're almost like pitching like the Bermuda model, right? And like bringing folks to the island to learn more so that you get more foreign direct investment as a way to then, have folks on the mainland, not just in the US, but also in Europe to then, learn about the model, create new partnerships, having more of the sanity and rationality and science and kind of hard data that drives the way that you all work compared to some other places that maybe aren't quite as grounded in reality. I think it only builds the brand. It builds, it's going to help the tourism economy. It's going to help the business community. I mean, I think the more that folks are aware of what you're doing, I think they're going to be surprised, especially for folks that are outside of the insurance space. But I think it creates huge economic opportunities for decades to come because you guys are so far ahead of so many other parts of the world.
Colin, Sam, thank you for all those comments. I see Jasmine taking notes as I did, and we're going to take all that to heart. You can see behind us some aspects of the Bermuda architecture. So one thing I do want to double click on is the point that you raised. Every Bermudian is safe in a storm, regardless of your economic profile. The building standards are consistent for reinsurance CEOs and young people who rent. I've lived through a series of hurricanes. I walked the same fox terrier through 3 Cat 3i walls, and the life safety damage of those storms was literally nothing, and the economic costs were pretty scant because of the building standards and community preparation commitment that Bermuda has. So I'm quite concerned. I think you've each touched upon this as we head into a storm season in the United States in the context of the pandemic. Americans of the most means will evacuate. They'll find a way to do it. Coastal regions have evacuation plans, which include keeping private jet terminals open longer. And our aspirations for helping Americans of lesser means get to shelter, go to the Superdome, are even more challenged in the pandemic context. And I hope we can keep all of Americans in mind as we head into this period. But I want to turn things over to Jasmine because we had a series of questions from the group, and I'd like to honor that. And Jasmine, maybe you've selected an audience question that we can share.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a really engaged audience, which is awesome. And this has been incredible. So yes, I have 3 pages worth of notes. But one question that came about was, and this is for both Samantha and Colin, and Steve, you can answer as well. What are some of the examples of strategies to mitigate the climate impacts of the agriculture sector on climate change? So for example, insurers are holding back on insuring the coal industry, and that's something we've seen in Bermuda. But what about the beef industry? So any comments on that? I'll give it to Samantha. Since you're not muted, I'm going to give it to you first.
Happy to. Thank you very much. For those that are going to take a look at our report, I really encourage you to take a look at the sections on agriculture, and not just the ways that we can be strengthening our agricultural sector in terms of resilience and adaptation, but also the incredible role that agricultural practices can be playing in carbon sequestration. But taken together, the recommendations that we're making are around really working with and lifting up our agricultural community and our farmers. It's an important part of our overall economy. But some of those specific recommendations that we make are really around working in partnership with the agricultural sector and looking for those opportunities to both mitigate carbon emissions, but also better prepare through healthy soil practices, through helping our farmers select more resilient crops and go about those practices in a way that can reduce carbon emissions, but also be more resilient. And then beyond that, there are lessons that we can be looking to for practices around the world and ways of deploying risk transfer solutions. For example, the use of parametric insurance around agricultural risk is an important area that warrants some further exploration. And then thinking about ways that we can, again, I alluded to this earlier, but help to secure the federal portfolios of risk, including crop. So those are just a few of the ideas that we have, but it really begins at a very local, granular level, and that's really helping to lift up our farmers. But then even looking more broadly at the ways that markets can be strengthened.
Thank you, Samantha. And Colin?
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, like I'm a huge fan of kind of the natural solutions and the working land solutions. They haven't received nearly enough attention until very recently. The opportunities to better soil management, the opportunities to restore grasslands and wetlands, and and frankly compensate farmers for the public goods that they're providing. I mean, we've driven folks towards kind of monocrop commodity kind of activities through just massive subsidization of things like corn ethanol, which is like one of my pet peeves, because it's more pollution than it takes to create, and pollutes more pollution than it avoids, and it's just horrible impacts on the soils and on water quality and the like. But really trying to make sure that we are doing more to create markets that create the right incentives for folks, and this could be things like cover crops. Right, if we have, we use cover crops a lot for water quality, that's important. It's also incredibly important for soil health. It makes land much more resilient, much less prone to erosion. And so there's all these multiple benefits. And, those programs have often been fairly voluntary. Funding's been somewhat episodic. There's, money may be available for a waterway like the, water kind of estuary like the Chesapeake Bay, maybe not as much for places like the Missouri River, which has seen catastrophic flooding the last couple of years. And so I think there's a whole lot of tools, and frankly, it's getting up to scale. I mean, there's a lot of conversation on methane that have to occur, but I think a lot of the starting point is both making investments, having the partnerships that Sam talked about, and then really making sure that we are creating real revenue opportunities. I mean, the agriculture sector in the U.S. at least, between the pandemic, the trade war, global commodity prices. It's absolutely brutal right now, and the farmers on the ground typically are the ones that have the most risk. The way these kind of relationships work with the kind of the mega producers in the business, and the revenues are anemic right now. And so if we want to get solutions at scale, I mean, I think we need to figure out ways to make sure that those investments are having a healthy return, and in some cases, a better return than some of the current practices that have unfortunately become a little lowest common denominator. In some cases, folks are just trying to squeak out a living. So huge opportunities and huge to come, but I encourage you to look at that chapter that Samantha mentioned, because I do think some of the best ideas out there right now are in that chapter.
The only quick comment I would add is the way that the U.S. addresses crop risk, like other risk, is arguably unique in the world. So there are a lot of competing considerations there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the way that we're doing it, and there could be enormous opportunities to provide better solutions for Americans, farmers who provide the benefits that Colin outlined, while being more scientifically sound, more environmentally sound, and better fiscal stewards as well. So, Jasmine, with your permission, as we head towards the hour, I'd like to invite our all-star guests to close out with a parting remark, if you wish, and I'll spoiler alert, and then I'll pause by thanking them.
Happy to, sure. And first, I'd really like to give a tremendous amount of credit for the advancements that we've seen through the Select Committee's report, to the Select Committee members themselves and the incredible staff. I have the great privilege of being just one part of an amazing team of experts that contributed the thinking, particularly around emissions, energy efficiency, agriculture and natural resources, the built environment, and climate science. They aren't with me on this call, but they are definitely with me in spirit. And of course, the leadership that we have across the Select Committee and across the House has really been fundamental to the advancements that we've seen and that we're even seeing now as we work to get infrastructure legislation across and continue to pursue and implement the recommendations that we've made here. I also really want to share a sense of what is giving me hope for the future. One of the things I had the great privilege to do that I've not done yet in a 30-year career is really sit down and talk with the youth leaders and activists that have been engaging so passionately and unwaveringly in this debate and in this incredible time. I would never make the mistake of saying, wow, you're so bright and you're so articulate, you have an incredible future ahead of you, because they don't think that they do. This is very real for them, and it's very visceral. And so it's what gets me out of bed every day and drives me in my work is what we're doing for all of our children and for these youth activists that are holding us accountable. It's just been an incredible privilege, but that's a big part of what does give me hope. We also do see great opportunities to continue to advance great policy So it's been a privilege to work with you all, and thank you.
Yeah, and I'd also just like to thank the BDA, thank Steve and the RenRe team. I think like there's a huge first mover advantage. I mean, companies that take this seriously, that make smart investments, that are willing to really focus on reducing risk and really kind of building resilience, and thinking about both ways to monetize that as well as reduce like long-term obligations on the balance sheet, are going to fare better. There's some places where there's this belief that ignorance is bliss. I think ignorance is death in this case. I mean, it's a death knell for businesses. I mean, for communities that don't take it seriously are going to be hurting in big ways. And I'm usually the optimistic guy. I'm not kind of doom and gloom at all, because I do think that there's still an ability to act. But I do think that the companies that take this seriously and the countries that lead are going to be incredibly well positioned for the next century. And so I would just encourage you all to lean in. After I finish, I'll put in a link to a natural solutions report that we put out. If folks are kind of interested in that kind of body of work and that body of scholarship, just to kind of get more up to speed. But to have so many business leaders, in Bermuda and around the world joining us right now to learn about this, which is, somebody said in the chat, this is a topic that doesn't get enough attention. It's often under considered, and obviously the U.S. has distorted a lot of these markets with very well intended but very poorly designed market intervention programs, whether it's flood insurance or crop insurance or various biofuel mandates, and so thinking through how to have the private sector and have real private capital come into these places as a way to really align the incentives so we are reducing risk and building resilience is going to be important. But I would just encourage folks to lean in, and if any of this seemed like it's a completely foreign language, we'd love to help. If there's folks that want to lean in a bigger way on the policy side or on the science side, we'd love to work there too. So my email address is colin@nwf.org. I'll put that in the chat as well. But we'd love to continue the conversation with anybody. And we love working with Bermuda. And if it requires an in-person meeting, we're happy to figure that out too. It's a really tough trip to convince me or my wife to come out and see you all in person. So Steve and Jasmine, it's an honor to be with you. And we love what you guys are doing, and we just want to help support it.
Thank you so much for those closing comments. And I was touched that both of you touched upon the youth. And there's so many ideas coming from Sam and from Colin, but if you're searching around on the internet, look for Colin's op-eds on a conservation corps proposal that would put young Americans to work, give them tools, and get a lot of good done building up the type of natural capital solutions that we talked across this call. And that's a proposal I've stolen. There's no good idea that shouldn't be copied a bit and shared with the Bermuda government as well. Let me close by thanking the BDA for hosting us, for our guests for attending and listening, sticking with us at the end of the hour, but particularly to Colin and Sam for sharing your time and your expertise and your passion on these topics. We've touched upon challenges, and they're sober and daunting. I always feel better talking with you and hearing from you. Your commitment and your enthusiasm leave me optimistic as ever. And I've seen you do, if not the impossible, certainly the quite challenging before. And I've got every faith that between us and our friends and contact networks, we can do the same going forward. Serious problems, but serious problems also present the most exciting challenges, whether from business or public policy. And I feel like we're going to move together forward in a better way. And I know I'll see you at the vanguard of that. Thank you again for all your time today.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on what Steve said. I want to thank Samantha and thank Colin for your time. And Steve, I want to thank you for leaning in and being a business leader within the Bermuda community and always keeping this subject at the forefront of everyone's minds. And it's going to be individuals like you that ensure that the changes that Colin and Samantha have pointed out are driven and move through. So we know that we have the capabilities and we're empowered by Samantha and Colin, that we are on the right track. We may be 21 square miles, but we do big things, and we appreciate the acknowledgement by Samantha and Colin. So thank you again, Steve. Thank you, Sam and Colin. For everyone, I'm going to get all of these resources together, the links, the reports, and I will send them off. So please do not be weary. Thank you for your time today. If you require any other further information about Bermuda or the BDA, please visit our website at bda.bm. I'm grateful for your time today, and everyone have a great day.